The hidden war against Soviet generals did not begin during World War II. It began years earlier, in silence, blood, and paranoia, and it never truly stopped. By the time Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, the Red Army was already a wounded institution, not because of German firepower, but because Joseph Stalin had deliberately shattered its leadership. Between 1937 and 1939, Stalin launched what later became known as the Great Purge of the Red Army. It was not a side effect of political terror. It was a targeted decapitation. 3 of 5 Soviet marshals were executed. 13 of 15 army commanders vanished into execution chambers or prison cells. Roughly half of all corps and division commanders were arrested, shot, or sent to labor camps. The officer corps was annihilated with bureaucratic efficiency. Interrogations were conducted under torture. Confessions were scripted. Trials were theatrical. Loyalty to Stalin mattered more than competence. Military experience, especially from the Civil War, was treated as proof of independent thinking, and therefore guilt. The message was unmistakable. Initiative was treason. Those who survived learned fast. They learned how to remain invisible. They learned to repeat Stalin's assumptions back to him. They learned that telling the truth about military readiness could be fatal. This culture of fear did not fade when the execution slowed. It hardened. By 1940, Stalin had nominally restored ranks and uniforms, but the damage was irreversible. Entire generations of trained officers were gone. Those who replaced them were younger, less experienced, and deeply cautious. They had been promoted not because they were the best, but because they had survived, and survival required obedience. When intelligence reports arrived warning of an imminent German invasion in 1941, senior officers hesitated to push the issue. Some did, many didn't. The cost of being wrong, or of contradicting Stalin, was too high. Stalin dismissed warnings anyway, but the hesitation mattered. The fear mattered. When Operation Barbarossa began, the Red Army collapsed with shocking speed. Entire fronts disintegrated. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were encircled and captured. Communications failed. Commanders froze. This was not just a military failure. It was the delayed detonation of the purges. Stalin's reaction followed a familiar pattern. Instead of accepting systemic responsibility, he searched for traitors. Generals were arrested for defeats they could not realistically prevent. Some were executed during the opening months of the invasion. Others were sent to prison camps while the war was still raging. Even catastrophe did not soften Stalin's paranoia. In July 1941, Stalin issued Order No. 270, declaring that commanders who surrendered were traitors and their families subject to punishment. This was not symbolic. Families were arrested. Wives were sent to camps. Children were branded. Fear became policy. Commanders now faced an impossible calculation. Retreat without orders could mean execution. Standing ground could mean annihilation. Reporting losses honestly could mean suspicion. Inflating success was cipher. Thus began a war fought under double pressure. German guns in front, Soviet terror behind. Political officers, commissars, were embedded at every level of command. Their job was not strategy. It was loyalty enforcement. They countersigned orders. They monitored conversations. They reported political reliability directly up the chain. A commander no longer commanded alone. The system bred caution, rigidity, and delay. Orders flowed downward. Initiative flowed upward only when requested. Independent action, one of the core principles of modern warfare, was dangerous. This environment shaped every Soviet general who who survived long enough to matter later. Among them was Georgy Zhukov. Zhukov survived the purges partly by luck, partly by timing, and partly by understanding the system. He watched colleagues disappear. He learned when to speak, when to remain silent, and how to frame military necessity in ideological language. Even so, survival did not mean safety. In 1941, after the disasters of the first months, Stalin briefly collapsed psychologically. He withdrew, convinced the party would remove him. When it didn't, he returned hardened, suspicious, and determined never to lose control again. From that moment on, Stalin resolved on two simultaneous goals: win the war, ensure no one else could claim ownership of that victory. The second goal would shape everything that followed. As the Red Army slowly stabilized in late 1941 and early 1942, Stalin permitted greater operational freedom, but never trust. Surveillance expanded, not contracted. Files accumulated. Notes were taken. Comments remembered. The trauma of the purges became institutional memory. Officers taught subordinates how to phrase reports. Losses were softened. Failures were reframed as temporary setbacks caused by external factors. Personal responsibility was diffused. Collective language was used to avoid individual blame. Truth became dangerous. Narrative became survival. This psychological landscape is essential to understanding what came next. Because when the Red Army finally began to win, when commanders like Zhukov became symbols of national resistance, Stalin did not see heroes, he saw threats. The hidden war was not an improvisation of the later years. It was the continuation of a system that had never stopped operating. And by 1942, it was ready to evolve. The Red Army entered World War II already defeated in one critical dimension: trust. Long before the first German tank crossed the Soviet border, the command structure of the Soviet military had been hollowed out by fear, suspicion, and calculated terror. This was not collateral damage of political repression. It was a deliberate restructuring of power. Between 1937 and 1939, the Soviet state did something no major power had ever done on the eve of a global war. It destroyed its own professional military leadership from the top down. The purge was systematic. Arrests were not random. They followed patterns that revealed Stalin's deepest anxieties. Officers with independent reputations were targeted first. Veterans of the Civil War who had personal followings inside the army were accused of conspiracy. Those who had studied abroad, interacted with foreign militaries, or expressed unorthodox tactical ideas were flagged as potential traitors. The accusations rarely changed: espionage, Trotskyism, plotting a coup, collaboration with foreign intelligence. The evidence was fabricated. The confessions were extracted under torture. The verdicts were predetermined. Execution was often immediate. This annihilation of experience created a vacuum that could not be filled quickly. Training academies could produce officers but not judgment. Promotions accelerated at an unnatural pace. Captains became colonels in months. Majors commanded divisions. Many were competent, some were talented, but all understood one thing clearly: their rank was conditional. The army that emerged from the purge was structurally obedient, but psychologically broken. Every officer knew that their predecessor had not fallen in battle. He had been erased. This knowledge reshaped behavior at every level. Tactical creativity was suppressed. Deviation from written orders was avoided. Officers learned to prioritize political safety over battlefield efficiency. A mistake made independently was more dangerous than a disaster caused by following orders. This culture persisted into the war years because it had been internalized. Terror no longer needed to be constant. Memory was enough. By 1940, Stalin recognized that the Red Army's condition was dangerous. He restored traditional ranks and insignia. He released a limited number of imprisoned officers, but these gestures did not undo the damage. They came too late and changed nothing fundamental. The command culture remained rigid, risk-averse, and deeply politicized. When intelligence warnings began arriving in early 1941, reports from border troops, foreign informants, intercepted communications, senior commanders faced a dilemma. They could press the issue and risk Stalin's wrath, or they could remain cautious and hope events forced his hand. Some officers did warn. Others softened their language. Many stayed silent. The system had taught them that being correct was irrelevant. Being safe mattered more. When the invasion came, it exposed everything. The first weeks of the war were catastrophic. Entire Soviet armies were encircled. Command posts were overrun. Orders contradicted reality. Units waited for authorization that never arrived. Others advanced blindly into destruction. The response from Moscow was not structural reform. It was punishment. Commanders were accused of cowardice. Some were arrested at the front. Others were shot after summary trials. The concept of operational failure did not exist in Stalin's worldview. Only loyalty and betrayal did. This response deepened the psychological collapse. Order number 270 formalized fear as doctrine. Surrender was criminalized. Capture was equated with treason. Families of prisoners were stigmatized or punished. The state made clear that survival itself could be evidence of guilt. The effect was brutal. Units fought to annihilation rather than withdraw. Encircled forces attempted breakouts with no chance of success. Losses mounted exponentially. Yet even this was preferable to retreat without permission. Political officers reinforced this environment. Their reports mattered more than battlefield results. An officer could win tactically and still be condemned politically. He could lose catastrophically and survive if the narrative aligned with ideological expectations. Language became a weapon. Reports emphasized heroism over accuracy. Failures were blamed on subordinate units, unexpected enemy strength, or sabotage. Personal accountability was diluted through collective phrasing. Commanders learned to write reports as defensive documents, not historical records. This distortion began early and would never fully disappear. Stalin's brief withdrawal in June 1941 has often been described as shock. In reality, it was recalibration. He returned not chastened, but hardened. The lesson he drew was not that terror had weakened the army. It was that terror must be better controlled. From this point forward, Stalin pursued a dual strategy. He allowed certain commanders greater operational latitude while simultaneously increasing surveillance over them. Success was permitted, but independence was not. Files were opened, conversations noted, patterns of behavior analyzed. The war created new figures of authority within the army, men whose reputations grew faster than Stalin was comfortable with. The system that had eliminated rivals in peacetime now adapted to wartime conditions. Open purges became impractical. Subtle pressure replaced overt violence. Monitoring replaced mass arrests. Future punishment replaced immediate execution. But the principle remained unchanged. No victory would be allowed to produce an alternative center of loyalty. By late 1941, as the Red Army stabilized and counterattacks began to succeed, the seeds of the hidden war were already planted. The trauma of the purges had conditioned commanders to fear visibility as much as failure. rising prominence became a liability. This psychological framework is essential to understanding everything that followed. Because the later surveillance of generals, the manipulation of reports, and the post-war purges were not reactions to wartime necessity. They were the continuation of a system designed years earlier. The war did not interrupt Stalin's struggle for control. It merely forced him to fight it differently. And in the next phase, as victories replaced defeats, that struggle would intensify. To understand how deeply the purges reshaped Soviet command behavior, one must abandon the idea that fear was episodic. It was continuous. It did not spike and fade. It became the operating system of the Red Army. By the late 1930s, officers no longer asked whether a decision was militarily sound. They asked whether it was politically defensible after the fact. This inversion of logic mattered more than any missing equipment or outdated doctrine. Every order carried two risks: failure at the front and suspicion at the rear. The purge did not merely remove individuals, it destroyed informal networks, the quiet trust between commanders, the exchange of candid assessments, the ability to disagree privately. Officers avoided frank discussion, even among friends. Everyone assumed informants were present. Often they were correct. This environment produced a specific psychological profile. Survivors became hyper-aware of language, tone, and timing. They learned to preempt accusations. They framed caution as ideological vigilance. They framed obedience as revolutionary discipline. Competence alone was insufficient. One had to perform loyalty. By 1941, the Red Army's leadership was younger, less confident, and conditioned to defer upward at every decision point. This was catastrophic in modern mobile warfare, where speed and initiative determined survival. German commanders exploited this immediately. Soviet units frequently waited for written orders while German forces maneuvered freely. When communications failed, as they often did, Soviet formations froze. Independent action was rare, not because officers lacked imagination, but because imagination had been trained out of them. Stalin's response was not to decentralize command. It was to centralize control even further. The creation of Stavka as the supreme command authority placed Stalin at the center of operational decision-making. This was not symbolic. He involved himself in details far below strategic level. Front commanders were summoned, interrogated, humiliated. Orders were issued directly from Moscow, sometimes based on incomplete or distorted information, but Stalin demanded certainty, and certainty was impossible. This created a paradox. Commanders were expected to predict outcomes perfectly, yet denied the freedom necessary to adapt when reality diverged from plans. When predictions failed, blame followed. The logic was circular and lethal. As defeats mounted in 1941, Stalin's distrust of the military deepened. He did not interpret disaster as evidence that the purges had been a mistake. He interpreted it as proof that enemies still existed within the system. Thus, repression continued, even as the state teetered on collapse. Execution slowed only because the front demanded manpower. Arrests continued quietly. Files were kept meticulously. Names were not forgotten. One of the most corrosive consequences of this environment was the distortion of feedback. Accurate reporting is the lifeblood of effective command. Stalin's system strangled it. Losses were underreported. Positions were misrepresented. Readiness was exaggerated. This was not mass conspiracy. It was individual self-preservation repeated thousands of times. The cumulative effect was strategic blindness. Stalin often operated with information that had been filtered through layers of fear. When reality intruded, his response was anger, not introspection. He assumed deception. He demanded harsher discipline. This feedback loop reinforced itself. Yet paradoxically, out of this system emerged commanders capable of extraordinary performance, not because the system nurtured them, but because it selected for a specific type of survivor. Men like Georgy Zhukov were not fearless. They were disciplined, resilient, and acutely aware of political boundaries. They understood when to push and when to defer. They learned to couch military necessity in ideological terms. They framed aggressive action as fulfillment of Stalin's intent, even when improvising. This was not flattery. It was armor. Zhukov's rise did not contradict the purge culture, it confirmed it. He succeeded because he mastered the rules of survival without being paralyzed by them. Most could not. Stalin noticed this. He valued competence, but only when it remained subordinate. As the Red Army stabilized in late 1941, Stalin faced a new problem. Victory required effective commanders. Effective commanders generated loyalty among troops. Loyalty could translate into influence. Influence could threaten the monopoly of power. This tension defined Stalin's wartime leadership. He could not repeat the mass purges of 1937 without crippling the war effort, but he could not allow independent authority to emerge unchecked. The solution was surveillance without spectacle. From this point forward, control would be exerted quietly. The trauma of the purges made this easier. Officers did not need to be told they were being watched. They assumed it. The absence of overt repression did not signal trust. It signaled conditional tolerance. Every promotion was provisional, every success temporary. This understanding permeated the officer corps. It shaped behavior long after the initial terror receded. It ensured that no general, no matter how successful, ever felt secure. The war did not interrupt this system, it refined it. By the end of 1941, the Red Army had survived the brink of annihilation. Moscow held. The immediate crisis passed, but the psychological architecture of fear remained intact. It would now be applied to a new phase of the war, one in which victory, not survival, became the primary concern. And in that phase, the hidden war against Stalin's own generals would no longer be about punishment for failure. It would be about control over success. When the Red Army began to stabilize and then counterattack, the character of Stalin's control changed. Terror did not disappear, it adapted. The mass arrests of the pre-war years had achieved their purpose. The officer corps had been conditioned. What Stalin required now was not spectacle but precision. The war demanded capable commanders. It also demanded that those commanders never forget who owned their success. The solution was surveillance embedded inside command itself. From late 1941 onward, every Soviet front operated with two parallel chains of authority. One was military, the other was political and security-driven. At the intersection of those chains sat the NKVD. The NKVD was not an external observer. It was not a rear area police force. It was integrated directly into operational command through special departments attached to fronts, armies, and even divisions. Their mandate was not tactical advice. It was political reliability, discipline, and intelligence gathering, primarily on Soviet officers. Every major commander understood this. Every major commander adjusted accordingly. No figure illustrates this dynamic more clearly than Georgy Zhukov. By late 1941, Zhukov had become indispensable. His role in stabilizing the defense of Moscow elevated him beyond most of his peers. Soldiers respected him. Junior officers followed him. His reputation spread rapidly, both within the army and among civilians. This was precisely what alarmed Joseph Stalin. Stalin valued effectiveness, but he feared popularity. In his worldview, mass loyalty belonged only to the party and ultimately to himself. A general admired for victories represented a potential alternative focal point of allegiance, even if that general showed no political ambition. Stalin did not confront this directly. Instead, he activated the machinery of quiet control. From this point forward, Zhukov was never simply a commander. He was a subject of continuous observation. NKVD officers were assigned to his headquarters. They attended briefings. They observed conversations. They compiled assessments of his tone, his temper, his treatment of subordinates, and his private remarks about strategy and leadership. This surveillance was subtle. Zhukov was not arrested. He was not publicly reprimanded. Instead, his environment was shaped to remind him constantly that visibility carried risk. Reports from Zhukov's headquarters did not move only through military channels. Copies flowed directly to Moscow. Some bypassed Stavka entirely and went straight to Stalin's desk. This mattered. In theory, Stavka was collective command. In practice, Stalin used it as a filter. He compared military reports with NKVD summaries. Discrepancies were noted. Tone was evaluated. Excessive confidence was flagged as arrogance. Excessive independence was flagged as potential disloyalty. Even success could generate suspicion. When Zhukov argued forcefully for certain operational decisions, particularly those involving concentration of forces or withdrawal to avoid encirclement, his reasoning was scrutinized not just for military merit, but for political implication. Did this proposal imply criticism of earlier decisions? Did it contradict Stalin's stated intent? Did it elevate Zhukov's judgment above that of the leadership? These questions mattered as much as terrain or troop strength. The presence of NKVD observers shaped how Zhukov and others communicated. Directness became dangerous. Officers learned to frame recommendations as extensions of Stalin's wisdom. Even when improvising, they attributed foresight upward. This was not ceremonial flattery. It was survival protocol. The NKVD's internal reports reveal a fixation not on outcomes alone, but on attitude. Commanders were assessed for correct political orientation, discipline in communication, and absence of unhealthy ambition. Ambition was a particularly sensitive category. A general who spoke confidently about future operations, who anticipated victory too openly, or who received excessive praise from subordinates could be marked as a risk, not an enemy. A risk. Risk did not require immediate action. It required monitoring. This surveillance extended beyond Zhukov. Commanders such as Rokossovsky, Vasilevsky, and others were all subject to observation. But Zhukov, by virtue of his prominence, received disproportionate attention. Ironically, his indispensability protected him, temporarily. Stalin needed Zhukov at critical moments. That need created a fragile equilibrium. Zhukov could act decisively at the front, but only within carefully maintained political boundaries. He could win battles, but he could not accumulate independent authority. The NKVD ensured that boundary remained visible. This system also distorted battlefield reporting. Commanders knew their words would be dissected. Reports increasingly emphasized collective effort. Individual initiative was downplayed. Success was framed as fulfillment of Stavka directives, even when those directives were vague or arrived after the fact. This practice did not originate from ideological zeal. It originated from fear. Losses were particularly sensitive. High casualties could be interpreted as incompetence. Retreats could be interpreted as cowardice. Even justified withdrawals required careful narrative construction. As a result, Stalin often received operational information that had already been sanitized. He sensed this. He assumed deception. That assumption reinforced surveillance. The loop tightened. By 1942, as the war shifted south and east, this system reached full maturity. NKVD special departments were no longer reactive. They were proactive. They anticipated potential issues. They compiled long-term profiles on commanders. They tracked changes in behavior over time. A general who became more assertive after success might be flagged. A general whose subordinates expressed unusual loyalty might be flagged. A general who spoke casually about Stalin's role, even neutrally, might be flagged. None of this required immediate punishment. The objective was leverage. Files accumulated quietly. They did not need to be used. Their existence was sufficient. Zhukov understood this. His behavior reflects it. He was blunt with subordinates, but careful upward. He avoided political discussion. He emphasized discipline and results. He did not cultivate a personal political faction. This was not modesty. It was calculation. Even so, protection was never absolute. Zhukov's popularity could not be erased. Soldiers talked. Officers compared notes. His name circulated as shorthand for competence. Stalin noticed. He did not act immediately. He waited. This patience is critical to understanding Stalin's wartime strategy. He was not reacting emotionally to each success. He was positioning himself for the post-war moment. The hidden war was not about stopping Zhukov from winning battles. It was about ensuring that when the war ended, no general could translate victory into power. By 1943, the system was firmly in place. Surveillance was normalized. Commanders accepted it as part of their environment. The Red Army was winning, but it was winning under watch, and the watch was tightening. By the middle years of the war, the NKVD was no longer an auxiliary force operating behind the lines. It had become an integral component of how the Red Army functioned under pressure. Its presence was not episodic or reactive. It was continuous, institutional, and deliberately opaque. This was not accidental. It was design. Stalin understood that mass terror on the scale of the pre-war purges was incompatible with sustained military operations. Entire formations could not be destabilized by public arrests during critical offensives. Yet the core principle of control, preventing independent centers of authority, remained non-negotiable. The solution was to move repression closer to the battlefield, but make it quieter. NKVD special departments were embedded within fronts and armies, operating alongside staff headquarters. Officially, their role was counterintelligence, rooting out spies, saboteurs, and defeatism. In practice, their primary focus was Soviet officers. They watched how commanders spoke, how they reacted under pressure, how they explained failure, and how they treated success. Crucially, NKVD officers did not answer to military command. They reported upward through their own chain, ultimately to Moscow. This meant that every commander, no matter how senior, operated with the knowledge that someone in the room had authority independent of him. This altered command dynamics in subtle but profound ways. An army commander could issue orders. He could not control interpretation. If an NKVD officer disagreed with a decision or simply chose to frame it negatively, that interpretation could follow the commander for months or years. There was no formal appeal process. During active operations, this translated into a constant undercurrent of pressure. Commanders knew that hesitation could be interpreted as lack of resolve. Aggression could be interpreted as recklessness. Casualties could be interpreted as incompetence. Survival could be interpreted as retreatist thinking. There was no safe option, only least dangerous ones. Arrests did not stop during the war. They became selective. Officers were removed quietly, often between operations. A division commander might be summoned to headquarters and never return. Official explanations were vague. Reassigned, under investigation, transferred to reserve. Subordinates learned not to ask. In some cases, arrests occurred during combat lulls. In others, they occurred while units were still in contact with the enemy. Command continuity was disrupted deliberately when political reliability was questioned. This was not chaos. It was control through uncertainty. One of the NKVD's most effective tools was ambiguity. Commanders rarely knew what specific action had triggered suspicion. This prevented learning or adaptation. The safest course was total conformity, not just to orders, but to perceived expectations. Language became increasingly standardized. Reports emphasized ideological commitment. Phrases like, "in accordance with Stavka's intent," appeared frequently, even when no such intent had been clearly articulated. Praise flowed upward. Responsibility flowed downward or outward. The effect on operational learning was corrosive. Honest post-action analysis became rare. Failures were not dissected, they were buried. Yet Stalin tolerated this distortion because it served a higher objective: monopoly of authority. The NKVD also monitored relationships. Commanders who formed close working bonds with subordinates were observed carefully. Excessive loyalty from troops was noted. Decorations awarded too enthusiastically were flagged. Informal influence mattered as much as formal rank. This surveillance extended to behavior off the battlefield: drinking habits, temper, personal disputes, private remarks. Everything could be material. Importantly, the NKVD did not need to fabricate guilt in most cases. The system produced enough ambiguity on its own. A poorly phrased remark, a delayed order, a disagreement recorded out of context. Files grew thicker over time. These files were not always used immediately. They were leverage, insurance, deferred punishment. Commanders sensed this. They moderated behavior accordingly. Many became emotionally distant. Others embraced rigid discipline as a shield. Some internalized the system completely and became its enforcers. The presence of the NKVD also affected how victories were distributed. When an operation succeeded, credit was carefully managed. Individual brilliance was downplayed. Collective effort was emphasized. Strategic insight was attributed to Stavka and, by extension, to Joseph Stalin himself. This was not merely propaganda for the public. It was a warning to the officer corps. No victory was personal. At the same time, failure could be intensely personal. A commander whose operation stalled could find himself isolated politically, even if circumstances were unfavorable. Support evaporated quickly when suspicion entered the equation. This asymmetry, collective success, individual failure, reinforced obedience. Despite this, the Red Army improved. Operational competence increased. Experience accumulated. By 1943, Soviet forces were executing complex, large-scale offensives with growing effectiveness. This created a new problem for Stalin. The better the army performed, the more visible its commanders became. Success generated reputations despite efforts to suppress them. Soldiers knew who led them. Officers knew whose decisions mattered. No amount of narrative management could fully erase that reality. Stalin responded not by loosening control, but by refining it further. Surveillance intensified around the most successful formations. NKVD reports became more analytical. Patterns of behavior were tracked longitudinally. The hidden war was evolving. It was no longer about rooting out imagined conspiracies. It was about managing power during victory. By late 1944, as Soviet forces pushed toward Germany, Stalin had achieved a precarious balance. He had an army capable of winning the war, but an officer corps that remained politically subordinate. This balance would not survive peace. The mechanisms built to control generals during combat were already being repurposed for the post-war reckoning. The war against Germany was nearing its end. The war against potential rivals was entering its final phase. By 1943, the outcome of the war had begun to tilt decisively in the Soviet Union's favor. Kursk marked the irreversible shift. From that moment onward, the Red Army advanced almost continuously. The Wehrmacht retreated, regrouped, and retreated again. But as the battlefield momentum changed, another campaign intensified behind closed doors. The war was being rewritten in real time. For Joseph Stalin, military victory alone was not enough. Control over the meaning of victory mattered just as much. Who was seen as responsible? Who would be remembered? Who would command loyalty once the guns fell silent? This concern was not abstract. Stalin understood history as a political weapon. Whoever controlled the narrative controlled legitimacy, and narratives, unlike armies, could be shaped quietly. From mid-1943 onward, the flow of battlefield information was deliberately filtered. Reports reaching Stavka were not simply operational summaries. They were political documents. Their phrasing, emphasis, and omissions were carefully calibrated. Commanders learned this quickly. Detailed operational reasoning was reduced. Individual initiative was obscured. Plans were retroactively aligned with Stalin's stated intentions, even when those intentions had been vague or contradictory at the time. This was not ordered explicitly. It did not need to be. The system incentivized it. A commander who framed success as the result of Stavka's foresight was safe. A commander whose report suggested independent brilliance was not. The effect was cumulative. Over time, Stalin appeared increasingly omniscient on paper. He anticipated enemy moves. He directed operations with precision. He corrected mistakes before they occurred. Reality was messier, but reality did not matter. Military historians later noticed a peculiar pattern in Soviet wartime documentation. Early reports were chaotic, defensive, and often contradictory. Later reports became cleaner, more confident, and more centralized in attribution. This was not simply improved bureaucracy. It was narrative consolidation. Stalin encouraged this indirectly by intervening selectively. When he publicly praised an operation, he emphasized collective discipline and ideological unity. When he criticized one, he focused on personal failings, never systemic ones. Commanders absorbed the lesson. Even victories became dangerous if described incorrectly. Take the treatment of operational setbacks within successful campaigns. Heavy casualties, miscalculations, or stalled advances were increasingly minimized or omitted in official records. Losses were reframed as necessary sacrifices. Errors became temporary difficulties. Meanwhile, credit flowed upward. The press played its role. Soviet newspapers highlighted Stalin's strategic genius. Maps showed arrows approved by Stavka. Speeches emphasized his calm leadership. Generals were mentioned, but rarely individualized. This was deliberate. Stalin had learned from earlier revolutions and wars that charismatic military leaders could outlive their usefulness. He would not repeat that mistake. Inside the army, this narrative management created quiet resentment. Commanders knew what had actually happened. They knew where decisions originated. They knew which orders arrived late, incomplete, or were improvised around. But knowledge without power meant silence. To challenge the narrative was to challenge authority. No general attempted it openly. Even Georgy Zhukov, whose role was impossible to fully erase, was carefully managed. His presence was acknowledged, but bounded. He was described as an executor of Stavka's will, not its source. Behind the scenes, NKVD files continued to grow. Statements were compared across time. Inconsistencies were noted. Private frustrations, if overheard, were recorded. Praise from subordinates was monitored. The purpose of these files was not immediate prosecution. It was preparation. Stalin was already thinking beyond the war. As Soviet forces crossed into Eastern Europe, a new dimension emerged. The Red Army was not just defeating Germany. It was occupying territory, installing governments, and reshaping the political map. This raised the stakes. Generals commanding occupation forces wielded immense power. They interacted with foreign populations. They negotiated with Allied counterparts. They made decisions with long-term consequences. Stalin could not allow such authority to become autonomous. Thus, the mechanisms of wartime control followed the army westward. Political officers intensified oversight. Communications were monitored more closely. Reports from occupied zones emphasized ideological correctness over local realities. Any deviation from Moscow's line was suspect. The rewriting of the war extended into diplomacy. Soviet commanders dealing with Allied officers were instructed to defer politically. Independent statements were discouraged. Public credit sharing was tightly controlled. Stalin wanted the image of unity at the top and singular leadership at its apex. By 1945, the official story of the war was largely complete, even before Germany surrendered. It depicted a disciplined, unified state led by an infallible center. Individual commanders appeared as loyal instruments, not historical actors. This story would harden quickly after victory. But its foundations were laid while shells were still falling. The hidden war had entered its most consequential phase. The fighting against Germany was ending. The struggle over memory, authority, and power was just beginning. And the men who had led the Red Army to Berlin were about to discover that survival in peace could be more dangerous than survival in war. The war ended, but the hidden war did not. For Joseph Stalin, peace was not a release from vigilance. It was the moment vigilance mattered most. The external enemy had been destroyed. What remained were men with reputations, memories, and authority earned on battlefields stretching from Moscow to Berlin. That was unacceptable. The end of the war created a political problem Stalin had anticipated for years. Millions of soldiers had followed specific commanders through hell and survived. They trusted those commanders. They spoke their names with respect, in some cases with affection. Stalin understood mass psychology better than any of his rivals. He knew that legitimacy rooted in victory was the most dangerous form of legitimacy of all. The transition from war to peace therefore triggered a controlled dismantling of military prestige. It began subtly. Victory parades were carefully choreographed. Symbols mattered. Who stood where, who spoke, who was photographed. Even at the Berlin Victory Parade, decisions were filtered through political calculation. The most visible figure of Soviet victory was Georgy Zhukov. His presence could not be erased. He was too closely associated with the final assault on Berlin. Soldiers cheered him openly. Civilians recognized him instantly. Stalin watched all of this. Publicly, he tolerated it. Privately, he took notes. The first phase of post-war control was narrative isolation. Zhukov and other senior commanders were praised in abstract terms, but denied sustained public platforms. Their speeches were limited, their roles in media tightly edited, their personal interpretations of the war excluded. The second phase was administrative displacement. Zhukov was removed from the center of power and reassigned away from Moscow. Officially, this was routine rotation. In reality, it was exile without accusation. He retained rank but lost proximity. Other commanders experienced similar treatment. Decorations did not translate into influence. Staff positions were reshuffled. Wartime networks were broken apart deliberately. This fragmentation was intentional. Stalin wanted no coherent military bloc capable of collective identity. Isolation reduced risk. Behind the scenes, NKVD files compiled during the war were reopened. Wartime remarks were reinterpreted. Casual statements became evidence of arrogance. Complaints about logistics became signs of disloyalty. Pride in battlefield decisions became Bonapartism. This accusation carried historical weight. In Stalin's lexicon, Bonapartism meant military ambition threatening civilian authority. It did not require an actual coup plot. Popularity was sufficient. Investigations followed a familiar pattern. Interrogations were framed as clarifications. Evidence was vague. Conclusions were predetermined. Zhukov himself was accused of exaggerating his role in victories and of appropriating credit belonging to Stavka. These accusations were not about facts. They were about narrative ownership. Stalin was reclaiming authorship of the war. Importantly, these actions were not accompanied by mass executions. The methods of the 1930s were unnecessary. The officer corps had already been conditioned. Demotion, isolation, and reputational damage were enough. Fear no longer needed spectacle. Other generals were less fortunate. Some were arrested. Others were removed entirely. Careers ended quietly. Wartime achievements were omitted from official histories. Names disappeared from textbooks. The message was unmistakable. Victory did not grant immunity. The political logic extended beyond individuals. The structure of the armed forces was reshaped to ensure long-term subordination. Political oversight intensified. The party reasserted primacy. The war was reframed as a collective struggle led by Stalin's genius rather than a complex interaction of commanders, soldiers, and circumstances. This reframing was codified rapidly. Official histories were written. Archives were sealed. Alternative interpretations were suppressed. Veterans learned which stories were acceptable to tell and which were not. Memory itself became regulated. For Stalin, this was not paranoia. It was consistency. The same logic that had driven the purges before the war and the surveillance during it now governed peace. Power had to remain indivisible. The irony was profound. The Red Army had achieved one of the greatest military victories in history. It had done so through sacrifice, adaptation, and leadership under extreme pressure. Yet its leaders emerged from victory diminished, constrained, and watched. The hidden war had succeeded. Stalin died in 1953. Only then did some of these constraints loosen. Files were reopened, reputations partially restored. The myth of infallibility cracked, but the damage was permanent. An entire generation of Soviet military leadership had been shaped by fear. Initiative had been punished. Independence had been dangerous. Even success had carried risk. This legacy extended far beyond World War II. It influenced how the Soviet Union fought later wars, how it trained officers, how it interpreted dissent, how it balanced competence against control. The hidden war against Stalin's own generals was not a footnote to victory. It was one of its defining conditions, and it serves as a reminder that authoritarian power does not end with external enemies. Sometimes its most decisive battles are fought within. The war that shaped the modern world did not end in 1945. For the men who fought it, led it, and survived it, another struggle followed, one without medals, without headlines, and without mercy. The story you've just heard was never meant to be told this way. It was buried in sealed archives, rewritten reports, and carefully managed memory. And there are many more like it. If you want the declassified version of World War II, the power struggles, the hidden decisions, the wars inside the war, subscribe now to WWO2 Declassified. This channel exists to uncover what official history left out. And the deeper we go, the darker it gets. Because the real war didn't always happen on the battlefield.